Good day. Yesterday, in my program, I discussed some information about the situation around the fighting in Bakhmut. I said that I'd seen a map and there'd been some explanations of the fighting from a Russian war correspondent, which clarified the position for me around Bakhmut. And there was also confirmation that the Russians are, in fact, their major target at the moment is, in fact, the road system around Bakhmut, and they seem to be closing in on the roads, on the various settlements that stand astride the roads, and that this is apparently the major target of the fighting at the moment in and around Bakhmut. Now, I say all of this because I was interested to see that yesterday the British news agency Reuters, which is, by the way, an entirely faithful reporter of the Ukrainian war from the British perspective, which is to say it is unswervingly faithful to the Ukrainian account of things. Anyway, yesterday Reuters admitted or published an article talking about referencing a senior US administration official who acknowledged that the Russians are making gains in the fighting in Bakhmut. And the words from Reuters were, heavy fighting around the largely ruined Ukrainian-held city of Bakhmut is likely to persist for the foreseeable future, with the outcome uncertain, as Russians have made incremental progress, according to a senior US administration official. And in fact, when you look at the actual information, you can see that this is correct. The senior US administration official apparently is also of the view that Russian tactics have improved and that the Russians are getting better organized in their fighting in and around Bakhmut and in Ukraine. Well, that may be true or not. I'm not able to say. But when he talks about, or she talks about, incremental progress, well, it is clear that the Russians are indeed advancing around Bakhmut. And yesterday, as I said in my video, I explained how they're doing it. And by the way, on that topic, there's been some more information over the course of today, and it seems that there's been quite a considerable battle going on in Solidar. It seems that Solidar, that the Russians have captured a railway station in Solidar. I'm not sure exactly what the significance of that is, but it does seem that they're making progress in Solidar as well, that they're gradually breaking down the lines in and around Solidar. And whilst I'm on the topic of the fighting in Bakhmut, there's been a number of reports, a number of people in various alternative media channels have picked up on an article that appeared in a Spanish newspaper. It's a Spanish language newspaper, which discussed the situation in the fighting, and it's by a journalist called Maria Senovilla. Now, and it appeared in the Spanish magazine Atalaya. Now, I would just say that this is a relatively old article. It appeared, apparently it was published on the 12th of December. So it's about 3 weeks old now. But nonetheless, I still think it is relevant. And I'm going to take the extract from Larry Johnson's website. Larry, unlike me, I think speaks Spanish. So I'm going to follow what I suspect is his translation, which I suspect is as good as any. And I'm going to make a guess, by the way, that most of the other people who have published this extract from this article by this Spanish journalist, that they're taking it from Larry Johnson's website, as I am doing. Though I want to make it clear, I do so with, I'm giving the source from where I'm getting it from. So this is what this journalist, Maria Senovilla, says. What is happening in the Battle of Bakhmut? The news we're receiving is of the death of very many people. Yes, we have to look to the Donbass because Bakhmut is precisely the blackest point of the war in Ukraine. This week, both the Institute for the Study of War, which is a prestigious American think tank, and other international think tanks have agreed that up to 400 Ukrainian soldiers a day are being killed and wounded in Bakhmut. And beyond the number, which is just a figure, I have been able to talk in recent days with different military sources, both official and combatants who have been there, and what they say makes one's hair stand on end. The city is for the moment under Ukrainian control, but the Russians have stationed their artillery close enough to fire there, but far enough away so as not to expose their troops too much. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian army, as it has to defend the terrain, has a lot of infantry, light units, paramilitary units that can do little against the bombs. This combat front has today become a real human meat grinder. That's how crude I can say it. And of course, this expression, the Bakhmut meat grinder, is now becoming very widespread. I dislike the expression, but I didn't coin it. But there it is. Right now, it is one of the most, if not the most worrying point for Zelensky's armed forces. Our listeners are probably wondering what is the importance of Bakhmut to take such a commitment to defend their position with such a very high cost to lives. And of course, Brian Beletic at the New Atlas has discussed this. There's been a whole roundtable discussion about the importance of Bakhmut. I believe also on the New Atlas with Brian participating. I've discussed it in recent videos. And this Spanish journalist has this to say about the importance of Bakhmut. Bakhmut is not an iconic city like Severodonetsk was, where one of the great battles of this war also took place. Bakhmut is not that kind of iconic city. However, it is a communications hub that is key to the supply lines of Ukrainian troops in Donetsk province, and it is also the buffer that contains the advance of Kremlin troops towards Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. If the Russian army were to take these two cities, and she means Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, it would gain almost total control of Donetsk province and therefore of the entire Donbass, something that Putin could already sell as a great victory. So you can imagine the effort that the Kremlin is putting right now in taking Bakhmut and what it is costing the Ukrainians to defend it. And this essentially, I think, is still the situation today, 3 weeks after that article was written. And we see, and Reuters has given us information from a senior US administration source, that the Russians are continuing to press on Bakhmut. I discussed yesterday how they seem to be working towards closing all the remaining roads, occupying the remaining roads leading into Bakhmut, and how Ukraine appears to be continuing to suffer very heavy losses in Bakhmut. And of course, if and when Bakhmut does fall, as I firmly expect, then contrary to the claims that have been made in many sources, particularly in Britain, by the way, that Bakhmut is of no strategic importance, this Spanish journalist who's talked to various Ukrainian officials concedes that in fact it is extremely important, that it is the hub of the Ukrainian communications network in Donbass. If the Ukrainians lose Bakhmut, they will not be able to move their troops around Donbass with the facility that they have up to this point. The Russians will be astride their communications, and if you look at Bakhmut on a map, you can see how from Bakhmut the Russians can advance in all sorts of different directions in Donbass, bringing the long-running Battle of Donbass the battle which started in earnest in May, finally to a close. The most consequential battle of the war by far. So Bakhmut is important. The Ukrainians are suffering heavy casualties defending it, and this Spanish journalist concedes again that because the Russians are able to locate their artillery so close to where the Ukrainians are, and because the Ukrainians are obliged to use lightly defended troops, light infantry, to try to hold Bakhmut, the Ukrainians are suffering very heavy losses in Bakhmut, whereas the Russians are not suffering losses to anything like the same degree. So it's an interesting article. Now, I would say that since that article was written, and around the time of Zelensky's visit to Bakhmut, if he did indeed visit Bakhmut, I think he did, by the way, as I've already made clear, but around that time, a lot of Ukrainian reinforcements were sent to the area, and apparently there were attempted counterattacks. There were counterattacks in northern Donbass, Kremenaya and Svatovo as well, but there was a particularly heavy counterattack by the Ukrainians in around Bakhmut, and particularly a particular target was to try to push the Russians back from the important settlement of Opitnoye, which, as I said, sits on top of the main road leading into Bakhmut from the south. Anyway, I get the impression that these counterattacks are now ebbing, that the reinforcements that were rushed to Bakhmut have also been degraded, but undoubtedly the fact that all those reinforcements were sent did slow Russian progress. It seems over the last couple of days that Russian progress has accelerated again. They've pushed the Ukrainians back in all the places that they counterattacked, and as I said, there's reports now that the Russians have made progress in places like Solidar and in Opitnoye itself, and in the various settlements that I discussed in my video yesterday. And it seems that they are now at least engaged in fighting close to the key settlement of Ivanovskoye, which is Ivanovka, sorry, I get these names wrong sometimes, which is to the west of Bakhmut, which sits astride the road leading into Bakhmut from the west. If the Russians take that place, well, one can say definitely that the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut would in that case be largely trapped, or so it seems to me. So that's where we are in terms of the fighting in Bakhmut. Now, I've also discussed in recent programs how it seems that there was some sort of Ukrainian attempt to relaunch an offensive in the Svatovo-Kremenaya region, and how this seems to have been unsuccessful. And there's more reports from Russian sources today that the Ukrainians may be trying to resume that offensive over the next few days in the Svatovo-Kremenaya area. I can't confirm that one way or the other. And there's also talk, interestingly enough, about, and this is time from Riba, this really very high-powered media resource, which, by the way, seems to have received some sort of official commendation from the Russian authorities, which would rather confirm my suspicion that Riba is actually relaying information that it's getting from Russian intelligence. That's a suspicion. It's not a fact. I want to make that absolutely clear. But anyway, Riba has also talked about the Ukrainians working towards, once again, planning on restarting their offensive in Zaporozhye region. And this would be the advance towards Melitopol, the attempt to break the land bridge between Russia and Donbass and Crimea. Now, it's always very difficult to give any estimate about what the Ukrainians are going to do. The Ukrainian military intelligence chief has again spoken about Ukraine planning an offensive very soon. He seemed to suggest that March was going to be a hot month, with the Ukrainians trying apparently some kind of breakthrough in March. I'm going to say this. I get the consistent impression that, as with all of these offensives that Ukraine has launched, there is always a battle between the Ukrainian military, the general staff, which is deeply skeptical about all of these offensives. They seem to have been opposed to both the Kharkiv and Kherson offensive. They see these offensives as throwing away resources, depleting Ukraine's limited manpower and weapons pool. And in a recent article that I discussed, Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vashinin, retired of the U.S. military, who's discussed all this in detail, also seems to be of that view, as does Scott Ritter, Douglas McGregor, Brian Beletic, all of these people with military backgrounds, that these Ukrainian offensives, far from putting Ukraine in a stronger position, are actually depleting its resources faster in what is essentially an attrition war. Anyway, I get the impression that the Ukrainian general staff understands this very well, that they want to husband resources, not fritter them away in these offensives, and that they would rather that Ukraine went on to basically a defensive strategy, holding back whatever Russian offensive might be pending, and at the same time building up its reserves, its manpower reserves, and its equipment, so that eventually, presumably once the storm of the Russian offensive has been weathered, Ukraine can finally go onto the attack. That, I get the sense, is what the Ukrainian general staff would rather do. But there's clearly countervailing pressures. There's pressures from the West. Lieutenant Colonel Vashinin talked about that as well, about the fact that the Western sponsors of Ukraine demand from Ukraine an endless string of victories to justify more spending on Ukraine, to show to Western taxpayers that their money is being put to good use. There's also undoubtedly pressures within Ukraine itself for Ukraine to continue to go on offensives, to justify to the Ukrainian people within Ukraine the enormous sacrifices that they're making, to give them some feeling that despite the enormous losses, Ukraine is somehow managing to keep the war going. And we see this from these commentaries that we regularly get from the head of Ukrainian military intelligence, the Ukrainian intelligence arm. Now, I'm going to make a guess that Ukrainian intelligence is probably even more than the rest of the Ukrainian military heavily staffed by people with radical nationalist ideologies. I participated in a program yesterday with Professor Glenn Deason and Professor Nikolai Petrov, in which we discussed at some length the nature of Ukrainian nationalist ideology. I'm going to make a guess that, as I said, Ukrainian military intelligence, of all the branches within the Ukrainian armed forces, is the one which is most heavily permeated with these rather heady and extraordinary ideas. Anyway, It's perhaps unsurprising, therefore, that Ukrainian military intelligence is the one that's always coming up with these reports about Russia running out of missiles, running out of ammunition, and which seems to be constantly pushing within the Ukrainian military structures for a renewed offensive by Ukraine, be it in Zaporozhye or in Kharkiv region against Svatovo, Kremenaya. And as I said, they repeatedly give the spin that, as I said, the Russian military is run down, exhausted, that it's losing effectiveness. Whereas we saw from the interviews that General Zaluzhny gave to The Economist last month, that he takes the diametrically opposite view, that the Russians are getting stronger, not weaker, that the mobilization in Russia has been successful, and that slowly, gradually, the Russians are building up their combat power in Ukraine, something which, of course, makes Zaluzhny even more reluctant to launch these offensives. And in that interview with The Economist, he made it very clear why. So we have this struggle going on within Ukraine about whether or not to launch offensives. And I'm going to say straight away that in every political battle, every battle about whether or not to launch offensives, those who advocate them, both in Washington and in Kiev, and of course in London, have won. So we've seen Ukraine launching its extremely costly offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson region this autumn, and we've seen renewed attempts by Ukraine over the last week or so to relaunch its offensive in Kremenaya Svatovo and go back on the attack in Bakhmut. And I fully expect, despite all the problems, that at some point they will do what General Zaluzhny apparently does not want Ukraine to do, which is launch a premature offensive in Zaporozhye region. Anyway, that's, it seems to me, what we can expect from the Ukrainians. But what about the Russians? Now, I've been discussing at very great length in many programs the fact that it seemed to me a certainty that the Russians would launch an offensive this winter. But straight away, I'm going to say that that hasn't happened. And there are, it seems to me, two reasons for it. One is the less important reason, which is the weather. I'm not going to discount its importance, but it seems that the ground has never in any part of Ukraine hardened to the extent that perhaps might have been expected in the winter season. This follows a pattern, by the way, of the last couple of years. Apparently, winters have been unusually mild, and the ground remains very soft and swampy, unsuitable for large, armored movements and that sort of thing. So it may be that that's played a role, though I personally think that the Russian military is fully capable of advancing through the mud if it wants to. I think the other major reason, and this is something which straightforwardly, as a non-military person, I did not take into account, is that there are aspects of the Russian mobilization that are taking longer than I imagined. So we've seen that large numbers of Russian troops have already been brought into the Russian combat units that have been fighting in the war in Donbass, around 80,000 of them, according to Putin. We also learned that another 80,000 have now been redeployed, hardening the Russian defenses in the areas behind the front lines, and that a further 160,000 or so are being trained to form some sort of operational reserve. And this operational reserve apparently is going to take the form of entirely new formations. And we see large, constant pictures now of tanks, armored vehicles, all kinds of weapon systems, guns, artillery, everything you can imagine being redeployed to the area. And one has to assume that part of this large armament that we're seeing coming from Russia to the war front is intended to equip rather these new formations, divisions, regiments, whatever, that are being built up for, well, we don't quite yet know what, but presumably to support or to participate or to carry out this offensive which is coming. Now, it's been explained to me that if you're going to do that, if you're going to create entirely new formations, that takes time. You have to spend a significant amount of time training the troops to learn how to work with each other in these entirely new formations. You need an officer cadre, obviously, to lead these formations, and that would take several months. And it's been suggested that March, April would be a more realistic time window for these formations to become combat ready. And others, including Lieutenant Colonel Vashinin, are suggesting that in fact the better policy for the Russians, given the extent of their build-up and the fact that they're building up their forces much faster than Ukraine can do, is that the longer the Russians postpone their big offensive, the better it would be for them, and it might actually make more sense for them to postpone their big offensive until the late spring. In other words, April, May, when the ground will definitely be hard and there won't be the same climatic problems, and that they can move much faster than they have done up to this point. So that's possible. I don't know. And I'm starting to think that that might indeed be the case. And it would be consistent with what General Surovikin has been saying, that he's building up Russian defenses, he's grinding the Ukrainians down, he's grinding them down in Bakhmut and in other places, in Kremenaya, Saratovo, in Zaporozhye as well, in Kherson region where Ukrainian forces are being constantly shelled by Russian artillery across the Dnieper River. All of that is going on all the time, and Ukrainians are being depleted in this way, and Russian forces are gradually accumulating and building up and becoming stronger. And there's been an interesting article by the Seika, one of the more insightful and interesting, though controversial, commentators on Russian affairs. You go to his website, you will find why he's controversial, but he is often an insightful commentator. And he has been suggesting that some of these Ukrainian pinprick attacks, the shelling of Donetsk, well, I don't know if that's a pinprick attack, but anyway, the shelling of Donetsk city, the deep strikes on Engels, the repeated attempts to strike at Crimea, the attacks on Belgorod region, all of that what the Ukrainians are trying to do is to goad the Russians into launching this offensive, which is being prepared with overwhelming power behind it, before the Russians are fully ready. Well, that seems to me to make sense. Again, as I said, I'm not a military person, and that does seem to make logical sense to me. Now, what form will this offensive take? Now, there's been a lot of discussion about this. A couple of weeks ago, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis came up with a very elaborate and complicated plan for the Russians to advance from Belarus all the way to the border areas, to western Ukraine, to cut off Ukraine's sources of resupply. And I said that that looked to me like a very, very risky project. And I've noticed that in his recent articles, Lieutenant Colonel Davis no longer seems to think that that is what the Russians will do. General Zaluzhny and several others have suggested a Russian push towards Kiev from Belarus. But there's been another suggestion now from the military summary channel, and it builds on what several people have been talking about, including, by the way, Lieutenant Colonel Vyshinin. Lieutenant Colonel Vyshinin talked about an advance from Zaporozhye northwards, Zaporozhye region, which the Russians control, northwards, cutting the main roads into Donbass from the south. And the military summary channel takes the view that simultaneously with that advance from the south, the Russians might be considering an advance from the north through Kharkiv region to a place called Lozovo, and that once the Russians have carried out this big pincer offensive, then the entire Ukrainian force in Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, which is 80% plus of the Ukrainian military, or at least the combat-ready part of the Ukrainian military, would be trapped. Now, is that what the Russians are going to do? Well, first of all, let me say straight away that I don't know. The second thing I'm going to say is that it is very like the plan which I think the Russians did have in the spring of last year, when it became clear back in March that the Istanbul agreements were not going to work, that Ukraine was not going to negotiate its neutrality and the secession of Donbass and the loss of Crimea. Well, I think at that point, the Russians focused on exactly what this complicated offensive, advance from the south, advance from the north, Russian forces meeting in central Ukraine, surrounding Ukrainian forces in Donbass. I think this is essentially what the Russians were planning at that time. And it didn't quite come off. And I think one of the reasons it didn't come off is because the Russians overestimated the importance of a town called Izium. I think they imagined that once Izium, which has been called the gate of the Donbass, had been captured, that this would massively disrupt Ukrainian communications, when in fact it turned out that it didn't, not to any significant degree. And anyway, I think that the Russians overestimated the importance of Izium, which they did manage to capture at the end of March, April period. And I think also the Russians underestimated the number of forces that would be required to carry out such a massive envelopment operation. And I think it was this which eventually caused a rethink of Russian strategy, a refocus on grinding Ukrainian forces down in Donbass, and eventually leading to this enormous buildup of Russian forces that we have been seeing since. But could the Russians now be revisiting that plan from last year, always assuming, of course, that I'm right and that they did indeed have such a plan? Well, I have to say that I'm not wholly convinced. Again, this big sweeping offensive from north and south, forces meeting up together, it's the kind of thing that the Red Army used to do in the Second World War, but it's risky, and it would involve an awful lot of very careful coordination, and it would be a complicated thing to pull off, and it would be risky. And it seems to me that Russian strategy in the war has now become relatively risk averse, and that they seem to be satisfied with their current policy of grinding the Ukrainians down. So I think that Lieutenant Colonel Vashinin is probably right. I think some kind of offensive from the south, from Zaporozhye, might indeed happen. But this huge advance to Lozovo, which, by the way, is west of Izium, in Kharkov region, I think that is less likely. But these are my guesses, and to be honest, I simply don't know. And to say something further, I think that before the Russians do carry out these sort of gigantic envelopment operations, which, as I said, they didn't fully pull off, but they didn't pull off last year, I think that the Russians would want to have degraded the Ukrainian military much further than has been the case up to this point, and that perhaps also explains why they're satisfied with the tempo of operations in places like Bakhmut for the moment, because what it is doing is it's causing Ukraine to lose more men and more machines every day, weakening the Ukrainian military overall, and perhaps creating the conditions for the kind of offensive that some of these commentators are talking about. If I'm going to just finish this by saying that if it is indeed the case that the Russians are planning or are considering this giant envelopment operation, then I very much doubt that we will see that kind of operation being launched any earlier than the late spring and early summer. I think training up the troops, equipping them with the new equipment, bringing in an awful lot of new equipment as well, which we haven't seen on the battlefields up to this point. The things that I was talking about in my video yesterday, the new drones, the new electronic warfare systems, all of that. Well, I think that, as I said, it will take time for all of this to appear on the battlefront. They will be there in significant, probably substantial quantities by late spring, early summer. I doubt that they would be available in anything like the kind of scale if, as I said, this complicated envelopment operation is indeed being planned. I doubt that they would be available before then. That doesn't mean that we aren't going to see a lot of fighting over the next few weeks and months. The Russians will, of course, continue their pressure on Bakhmut, continue their pressure on Donbass. Personally, I think that they will gradually, once more, intensify their advance on Bakhmut over the next few weeks. They break Ukrainian defense in Bakhmut, then it seems to me that Donbass, the position in Donbass Ukrainian position in Donbass might start to collapse in any event, and that might make these complicated and rather risky envelopment operations unnecessary anyway. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about, a lot of the strategizing that some people are engaging in. Now, what is the West going to do? They can see this enormous build-up of forces that the Russians are engaging in. Or can they? There's been an extraordinary and I think very powerful and very interesting article on Larry Johnson's website. And he said that the US military, and bear in mind Larry is a former CIA intelligence officer, a senior CIA intelligence officer, he says the US military is relying on Ukrainian intelligence. And he goes on to say, I have confirmed that the Dutch intelligence agency is relying solely on Ukraine for the intelligence on Russian and Ukrainian casualties In other words, if Ukraine tells its Department of Intelligence Agency liaison officer that Ukraine killed 400 Russians in its latest HIMARS strike, then that is what the DIA tells the US general commanding EUCOM. This is more than troubling, this is dangerous. And that is absolutely true if it is indeed what is happening. If the United States is indeed depending on Ukraine for its understanding of what is going on the battlefields, then that is extremely dangerous indeed. Trouble is, I think that Larry Johnson is almost certainly right. I read carefully what the British Ministry of Defence regularly writes about the progress or the developments in the war. I also follow very carefully what the United States says. And I have to say that I am regularly bewildered by the claims that are made about the demoralization, seeming collapse of the Russian military, the vast losses it's supposed to have suffered, things which, as I said, General Zaluzhny himself, the Ukrainian commander-in-chief, doesn't appear to believe. And yet, the American and British defense ministries, their intelligence agencies, seem to be reproducing these claims. And where are they coming from? Well, I said earlier in this program that I suspect that Ukrainian military intelligence is one of those bodies that is most heavily permeated by Ukrainian nationalist ideologies, and that it is Ukrainian military intelligence which is presumably providing all this information to the British and to the Americans. And I have to say, if that's correct, and I suspect it is, and I suspect Larry Johnson is absolutely right, then that is one of the reasons, surely, why the United States and Britain and other Western countries have been getting such a confused and warped idea, distorted idea about the progress of the war. They're not relying, as they should, exclusively on their own intelligence gathering. They're basing too many assumptions on what Ukraine is telling them. But they do seem to understand that Ukraine does have a problem, that its ammunition supplies are running low, that their Ukrainians are heavily outgunned by the Russians, that Russian missile strikes across Ukraine are causing Ukraine devastating problems. And we have reports now that once again the Western powers are starting to think of doing things which they had previously ruled out doing. So we hear that France, the Macron government, is going to take what I suspect is a deeply unpopular step, unpopular with the French military as well, of starting to supply Ukraine with light-wheeled tanks, a weapon system, by the way, which I suspect is hopelessly inappropriate for use in Ukrainian conditions. But then what do I know? But there are now very convincing reports that the French Caesar howitzers, self-propelled howitzers that have been provided to Ukraine, and which Ukraine has been using, the attack, the shelling of the restaurant complex in which the Russian politician Dmitry Rogozin was wounded, was apparently carried out by a French Caesar howitzer. But it seems these Caesar howitzers mostly are constantly breaking down. One of them has broken down apparently beyond any hope of repair. Only 18 could be supplied, and it's becoming a struggle for Ukraine to keep these howitzers operating. And I suspect that these French vehicles, wheeled tanks as they've been called, with their rather light 105mm guns. They were intended, as I understand it, as reconnaissance vehicles, not really as tanks at all. But anyway, I suspect that they're going to be hopelessly outmatched and outgunned if they're sent to fight the Russians in Ukraine. They might be useful for these Ukrainian infiltrator groups, the reconnaissance and sabotage groups that the Ukrainians sometimes deploy. But to be frank, if they're caught in the open by Russian artillery or Russian tanks, then it seems to me that their survival prospects are nil. So dangerous weapons to send to the Ukrainians, but it looks as if Macron, doubling down, he wants to be seen as leading in the supply of military equipment to Ukraine. Well, it looks as if that's what Macron is going to do. And we're now getting reports, partially confirmed by President Biden himself, that the United States is thinking of sending Bradley infantry fighting vehicles to Ukraine. Now, to be clear, these are much better adapted for Ukrainian conditions, or so it seems to me, than these wheeled tanks that Macron is apparently proposing to send. But I suspect that they are also going to run into problems. And I think here the problem is going to be the exact opposite than was the case with the French vehicles. If the French vehicles are too light and thinly armored, and as a result would be intensely vulnerable to Russian artillery and tanks, the Bradleys are, on the contrary, too heavy for Ukrainian roads, too maintenance heavy for the Ukrainian military. They're probably too complex and to operate effectively in these very tough Ukrainian conditions. And, well, they are formidable infantry fighting vehicles if used in the kind of conditions, no doubt, that they were designed for, battles in Central Europe during the Cold War, and of course perhaps in the Middle East too. But I think that they too would probably prove less than fully effective if dispatched to the Ukrainian front lines, just as every other weapon system that the United States has deployed has run into various problems, up to and including the HIMARS missile systems, which Ukraine is apparently expending at a rate that even the Americans find disproportionate to what is being achieved. So why are the French and the Americans now thinking about sending these weapon systems to Ukraine? Well, General Zaluzhny recently spoke about the fact that he needs 300 tanks, 600 to 700 infantry fighting vehicles, 500 howitzers to conduct a successful offensive. Could be that this is partly an attempt to do that, to provide General Zaluzhny with at least some of the vehicles and weapons that he says he needs. But I can't help thinking that it's also partly displacement. The United States and the Western powers have gradually come to realize that they cannot replace Ukraine's ammunition, that they can't provide Ukraine with the 155mm shells that it needs to keep its artillery operating even at the tempos that Ukraine was using a few weeks ago. And so, given that they can't supply more shells, they are now doing other things. They've apparently working to reopen a factory in Romania that makes Soviet caliber 152mm shells to supply to the Ukrainian artillery, which was based on Soviet calibers, what's left of it from before, what Ukraine had before the war. Trouble is, I can't imagine that an old Romanian factory is going to produce anything like enough 152mm shells to make any significant impact in this war. If the mighty United States cannot produce enough 155mm artillery shells to meet Ukraine's needs, how is Romania going to do so with 152mm artillery shells? It's simply not practical. So what they're doing instead, what the Western powers are doing instead, is that they're coming up with these other systems. They're sending instead possibly Bradleys, very likely Bradleys, before very long, and they're going to send these wheeled tanks and vehicles like that to Ukraine also. They might not help Ukraine very much, but at least they provide Ukraine with something, and it enables Western leaders to go on pretending that even as Ukraine continues to claim massive casualties that it is inflicting on the Russians, that Western support for Ukraine continues undiminished. Well, there we are. This has been a program, as I said, it's been more about strategies and discussions and what the West is doing. I'm going to repeat again. I've been following Russian news fairly closely at the moment. The Russian build-up does appear to be massive. We're now getting reports that over the last few weeks, something like 40 fighter jets of various forms, including Su-34s, Su-35s, and the new Su-57 fifth generation fighter jet. New fighter jets have been delivered to the Russian military. We hear that the Russian military has just taken another delivery of 10 upgraded Kamov 52M helicopter gunships. These are apparently more advanced than the helicopter gunships we've seen up to now. There's pictures appearing of Russian bombs, new bombs, which apparently are going to have been provided with kit, which will convert them from normal gravity dumb bombs to precision guided bombs, something that the United States has had for a while. The Russians have been slow to do it. They're now doing it. We're hearing more reports of vast numbers of drones being put into service by the Russians. And as I discussed a short time ago, Putin has appointed an entire committee headed by the Deputy Prime Minister Igor Belousov to go on producing more and more of these drones, and we'll be seeing many more of them on the battlefields before very long. And of course, hundreds of thousands of troops have been called up in Russia, are going through various processes of training, and are being gradually either inducted into existing formations on the battlefields, or they are being used to create entirely new formations. And in the meantime, General Surovikin, who, contrary to some reports, by the way, in the British and Israeli media, still seems to be very much in charge, he continues his policy of building up elaborate defenses in places like Svatovo, Kremenaya, and along Zaporozhye to parry any Ukrainian offensives in that area. And he is continuing to bleed the Ukrainians dry through this battle that he's fighting in Bakhmut. Compared to all of this, what the West is doing on behalf of Ukraine is starting to look, I have to say, very meager. I don't know what form the Russian action will take, what the offensive will take, and as I said, I've probably been wrong in assuming it would happen this winter. It may be happening later than I'd expected. But, you know, that's only my own guesses. But one way or the other, it does look like overwhelming forces are gathering around Ukraine, and this provision of Bradley fighting vehicles, wheeled tanks, a single Patriot battery, which will perhaps not be supplied to Ukraine until next year, doesn't look as if that's going to be anywhere near enough. Now, before I finish this video, I did discuss in a recent video when I was discussing Putin's New Year address how one effect of this war has been to strengthen, to accelerate the processes of building up Russian civil society. And somebody pointed out to me that there's been actually a whole article about this by one of the most astute observers of the Russian domestic scene, who is Gilbert Doctorow, who has been working in Russia in one form or another since the 1970s, and who has been very familiar with the state of things in Russia itself. And Gilbert Doctorow says that Western commentary, which has been focused upon the extent to which the war has consolidated Ukrainian society, as Gilbert Doctorow points out, this somewhat ignores the vast refugee flow out of Ukraine, which does suggest a rather different story. But whilst they've been talking about that, they have been ignoring the extent to which the war appears to be consolidating Russian society. And he talks about some of the perhaps more controversial aspects of this, the fact that a lot of people of pro-Western views in Russia have been losing their jobs, leaving universities, leaving the country entirely. One shouldn't, I think, overstate the extent of this, by the way, but he is talking, perhaps rather more interestingly, at least for me, about the way in which, to use his words, the war has created closer bonds which are being forged in the population as large, based on new self-confidence and support for the war effort in Ukraine. And he talks about how there's been a new phenomenon of volunteer work across the Russian Federation to solicit and collect contributions in money and kind to support the Russian soldiers in the field, how newly formed local NGOs have been created, how a new phenomenon of volunteering, remarkable in scope, is coming forward. He also points out something which is, by the way, entirely true, how Duma members, administrators and legislators from oblasts, that's regions, reaching across European Russia, across Siberia to Kamchatka and the Far East, are also involved in this process, with some of them, and some of their children, by the way, actually enlisting, volunteering to participate in the war. And he also discusses how Russian cities led by Moscow and St. Petersburg have made collective contributions of manpower to assist the war effort, and how in the time since the September mobilization, whilst the proper conditions for a major offensive against the Ukrainian army are not yet met, the Russians have been busy doing groundwork to ensure that there will be no further Ukrainian breakthroughs, such as happened in Kharkiv in the late autumn. They have dug in and created second and third lines of defenses consisting of well-executed trenches and pillboxes. And who did much of this? It was done by 20,000 municipal workers sent to Donbass by Mayor Sobyanin of Moscow, and an additional 10,000 civilian workers sent by St. Petersburg. And Dr. O talks about how Moscow and St. Petersburg, the two richest cities in Russia, are now leading the effort to help the people, help the war effort on the front lines. And Dr. O also discusses the long-term effect of this, and one of the most interesting things he says is, for me at least, is that after the war is over, there will be a large pool of people, field officers, project managers, that sort of thing, who will have honed their skills in this war and who will have obtained very practical and useful experience running commercial enterprises. And we may expect to see decorated officers taking an honored place among the top managerial caste in Russia as it retools and industrializes. And Dr. O says that there's nothing extraordinary about that. After World War II and the Korean War, most top executive positions in American corporations went to veterans. And I would, by the way, add to that a view that I, and I know a number of others, have held for a long time, which is that one of the major weaknesses that the Russian economy has experienced over the last 10, 15 or so years is the pool of project managers, people trained in engineering, top engineering, and management skills, of which the Soviet Union had been extremely rich, that became disastrously depleted during the 1990s and thereafter, and that Russia, over the last 15 years, has been short of really effective and successful project managers to run the big industrial and infrastructure projects in which investment has been going. And whilst there's been a certain amount of progress over the last few years in this precise field, many of the problems we've seen in things like, for example, the space program, the Russian space program, and indeed in some of the armaments fields, has been caused precisely by this lack of project managers. And it does seem, and I think here I completely agree with Dr. O, that one consequence of the war is that a new big pool of project managers is now being created in Russia. Anyway, I found it an interesting article by Gilbert Doctorow, providing a link under this video. You can read it yourself and form your own view. Anyway, that's me for the day. This video is just over an hour long, so I'm going to stop at this point. More from me soon, but remember, you can find all our videos, my videos, Duran videos, Alex Christoforou videos on various platforms, including Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You should also look up our shop, see the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and check your subscription to this channel. And it only remains for me to thank you again for watching this program and to wish you a very good day and to look forward to you joining me again soon. Thank you, and as I said, more from me soon.